Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max. සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න. Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max. සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න.
Nava Dove Healthy Ritual. 4 එකක් moisturizing milk, cornflour සහ coconut oil සමගින්.
හරිම සුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Thursday, the 12th of January 2023. Violating fundamentals. Supreme Court orders former President Maithripala Sirisena and respondents to pay compensation to Easter Sunday victims. Write down loans. Central Bank Governor Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe urges China and India to act quickly and agree with the write-downs of their debt to Sri Lanka ASAP. Pros and cons. Some economists believe that debt forgiveness is the only way forward, and the IMF is stalling the process deliberately.
No way Sri Lanka can recover paying the full amount of this debt.
This is deliberate. It strengthens the hands of the creditors.
While some other economists believe otherwise.
We will precipitate the collapse of our entire banking system if we were able to do a debt forgiveness.
Possibilities. We'll explore possibility on providing moratorium to protect business community, says President Ranil Wickremesinghe.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9 with Andrew Bernard. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Very good evening and welcome to AdaDerana 24's English News. Now, the Supreme Court finds that former President Maithripala Sirisena, former Defence Secretary Hemasiri Fernando, former IGP Pooja Jayasundara and the former National Intelligence Chief Cesar Mendes and the former Chief of State Intelligence Nilantha Jayawardena have violated the fundamental rights by failing to take action to prevent the Easter Sunday terror attacks, despite receiving sufficient intelligence information. Delivering the verdict after considering 12 petitions filed against them, they were ordered to pay compensation to the victims of the Easter Sunday attack. The former President Maithripala Sirisena was ordered to pay 100 million rupees in compensation, while former IGP Pooja Jayasundara and former State Intelligence Service Nilantha Jayawardena were each ordered to pay 75 million rupees. Former Defence Secretary Hemasiri Fernando was ordered to pay rupees 50 million, and the former National Intelligence Director Cesar Mendes was ordered to pay 10 million from their personal money. 12 petitions, including the ones of the Colombo Archdiocese and the victims of the Easter Sunday attacks that took place in Sri Lanka in April 2019, killing 271 people, filed against former President Maithripala Sirisena, former Defence Secretary Hemasiri Fernando, former State Intelligence Chief Nilantha Jayawardena, former National Intelligence Chief Cesar Mendes and former Inspector General of Police Pujit Jayasundara, stating that their fundamental rights were violated due to negligence and failure to prevent the attack, was taken up for hearing today before the 7-member Supreme Court bench, including Chief Justice Jayanta Jayasuriya. While delivering the observations of the Supreme Court judge bench, the Chief Justice said former President Maithripala Sirisena has no right to act without responsibility, stating that he has not informed about the intelligence information on the attack, since the Triforces, National Intelligence Service and Sri Lanka Police was held under his command. The Chief Justice also said the meetings of the National Security Council too had not been convened in an appropriate manner prior to this attack. Considering all these facts, he said the former president has neglected his responsibilities. With regard to former Defence Secretary Hemasiri Fernando, Chief Justice said he has not taken further steps beyond providing information he received on the Easter Sunday attacks to former National Intelligence Chief Cesar Mendes. He also said that Fernando had not discussed sensitive matters pertaining to national security at the National Security Council meeting on the 9th of April 2019 and that steps could have been taken to avoid such an incident if the matter was discussed, adding that he has failed to fulfill his duty. On former Inspector General of Police Pooja Jayasundara, the Chief Justice said he failed to act with responsibility over the information provided by the National Intelligence Service on a planned attack on the Easter Sunday by the National Tawheed Jamaat. Chief Justice Jayasuriya is of the view that the former IGP could have paid attention to the seriousness of this matter and had acted with responsibility. Meanwhile, making his remarks on the former State Intelligence Service Chief Nilantha Jayawardena, the Chief Justice said although he has forwarded the intelligence information received from a foreign intelligence service of a planned attack by a terrorist team including Zahran Hashim to the former IGP and the former National Intelligence Chief, the ex-SIS chief has failed to follow up on the matter and informed this to the former president when he went to wish him for the Sinhala and Tamil New Year that year. The Chief Justice said Nilantha Jayawardena has no ability to evade stating that he passed the information to the former IGP and the Defence Secretary. Delivering more observations, the Chief Justice said the former chief of the National Intelligence Service had failed to conduct a follow-up after passing the intelligence information received on a planned attack to the former Secretary of Defence and the former IGP. He also said the former NIS chief had also neglected his duties by failing to discuss this matter at the 9th of April 2019 National Security Council meeting. Based on the Supreme Court observation and facts presented, the Chief Justice said the respondents of this case have violated the fundamental human rights as per Article 12(1) and 14(1) of the Constitution. After considering the facts presented by the attorneys of the petitioners, the Supreme Court then ordered the respondents to pay compensation to the Easter attack victims. Accordingly, the Supreme Court ordered former President Maithripala Sirisena to pay 100 million rupees in compensation to the petitioners, while former IGP Pujith Jayasundaram and the former State Intelligence Chief Nilantha Jayawardena were ordered to pay 75 million each. Former Defence Secretary Hemasiri Fernando was ordered to pay 50 million rupees, and former National Intelligence Director Cicero Mendes was ordered to pay 10 million rupees each from their personal money. In addition, the judgment also states that a fund needs to be set up to deposit the compensation and that the government should deposit 1 million rupees into it. The Supreme Court also ordered the respondents to pay their relevant dues within 6 months. Now, President Ranil Wickremesinghe says that while the government is interested in enterprises in the country, as it is the lifeblood of the nation, they are looking at bringing new laws to empower women entrepreneurs in the country this year. Meanwhile, the President also went on to say that in order to protect the business community in the country, the possibility of a moratorium will be investigated and necessary relief will be provided in this regard.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe presided over an award ceremony organised by the Women Chamber of Industry and Commerce Sri Lanka in appreciation of women entrepreneurs in the island.
A micro category, a large number of women who run small shops at the village level, mainly for food, but also for other items, even to sell vegetables, all that. That's the micro aspect. Now, how do you help them too? The people who run, some of those who run the mom and pop shop after the pop has gone, and others who run various businesses. If you go down there, if you go into a large city, you won't find so many women entrepreneurs. And the largest number which is not recognized in Sri Lanka, the moneylenders. There's a large number of women moneylenders, and in some areas, actually, they are the ones who dominate. So that there are a large number of micro enterprises going on. The government too is interested to look at all the micro enterprises, not only by women, but also by men that is run in the country. That's the lifeblood of our economy. Especially this year, we'll be introducing some laws drafted by the Women's Caucus in Parliament, which will also deal with women's empowerment and the Women's National Commission. It has been a very, very difficult year, and there have been many businesses that have gone under, run by women, run by men, run by families. Despite all these problems, you still had the courage to stay afloat, and I must commend the number of new activities. But it certainly has been a difficult time for all of us. Not merely those who run business, but those who are in jobs, those who are at home. We have all faced a difficult time, and we still are undergoing those difficulties.
The chairman of the Export-Import Bank of China, Wu Fulin, and the President Ranil Wickremesinghe agreed to further strengthen exchanges and collaboration on the resolution of Sri Lanka's debt issues. According to the Chinese embassy in Sri Lanka, the remarks were made during a virtual discussion on Tuesday this week. China's Exim Bank chairman has agreed to help the island's economic recovery and sustainable development. The chairman of the Export-Import Bank of China and President Wickremesinghe have also exchanged views on bilateral cooperation and Sri Lanka's current debt issues. Now, the central bank governor Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe says Sri Lanka urged both China and India to agree on a write-down of their loans as soon as possible as the country awaits debt assurances from creditors, a prerequisite for the negotiated $2.9 billion IMF bailout package to be granted. Speaking to BBC's Newsnight, the central bank governor said it was in the interest of all parties to act quickly.
Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, told BBC Newsnight that the sooner finance assurances are granted by the creditors, it would be better for both sides, meaning the creditors and as a debtor. He said Sri Lanka will then be able to start repaying debt obligations. Dr. Veerasinghe also pointed out that Sri Lanka does not wish to remain in a situation where debt obligations are not met for too long, and that it is not good for the country and not good for investor confidence in the country. Dr. Veerasinghe went on to say that an agreement was possible later in January, but that this all depends on the other parties, Sri Lanka's bilateral creditors, who really have to make a decision. He added that Sri Lanka had now provided the creditor nations with all information on the country's borrowings they had needed. Asked about the country's private bondholders, Dr. Veerasinghe said Sri Lanka is engaging and negotiating with private creditors in good faith and that they are positively engaging with the authorities here. Sri Lanka's central bank chief said he expected that once the agreement from bilateral creditors has been received, the IMF funds could be disbursed within 4 to 6 weeks.
Now, development economist Professor Jayati Ghosh and economist and social scientist Dr. Howard Nicholas believes that the path Sri Lanka chose for economic recovery with the support of the IMF would hurt the island's poor and marginalized segments. Making these remarks at Hyde Park with Indivari Amuwatta on AdaDerana 24, they said they believe that debt forgiveness would be the only solution for Sri Lanka's recovery. On the contrary, however, financial analyst Murtaza Jafaji is of the opinion that Sri Lanka would lose access to international creditor markets as soon as it resolves to debt forgiveness, while also causing a collapse in the country's banking system.
This document prepared by close to 200 economists, including yourself. So what are these fundamentals that you looked at in the Sri Lankan economy?
This is an unsustainable debt. It has to be cut. There is no way that Sri Lanka can recover paying the full amount of this debt and on the current terms. When it comes to sovereign debt, it becomes a huge issue because of the complexity, and suddenly it becomes very moral and fingers are pointed and people say, you're living beyond your means. So in fact, the problem is that if you impose the IMF-type package, it's the poor who will suffer. The excessive borrowing that Sri Lanka indulged in, it's relatively new because they're encouraged to go in for these international sovereign bonds. And it's not just a question of being nice to other countries or helping. It is because you are responsible for this. You cannot be devoid of blame. The IMF head, Christina Georgieva, had already said that, yes, you must spend more. But when it comes to the IMF advising countries on the ground, the ones who are facing balance payments problems, they don't do that. They impose the same austerity, which we know is counterproductive. I can assure you that the United States, the European Union, Japan, the G7 would never dream of doing that in a crisis. They would do counter-cyclical policies. They would expand public spending in a period of downswing. They absolutely do the opposite of what they let the IMF force countries in distress to do. So the idea of counter-cyclical spending is, in a way, it's a no-brainer. There are now umpteen surveys and studies that show that the IMF conditionalities of that rigid austerity-making and make things worse, cause countries to go deeper into recession, depression, dramatic falls in employment, increases in poverty, increases in hunger. It is so widely documented.
Do you think that we could expect austerity measures to be waived off by the IMF, as well as creditors to be considering to take Sri Lanka's debt burden off?
So with all due respects to the eminent economies, I simply don't agree. And I think it will be counterproductive for us. Our debt is not odious debt. We borrowed in good faith. Unfortunately, our policymakers got all the policy interventions all wrong. It was very clear in early 2020 when COVID impacted us that we had a solvency problem. But our policymakers started behaving that this is a liquidity crisis, and they postponed an inevitable restructuring by 2 years. If we had restructured our debt earlier, the pain would have been much less and the loss to the creditors also would have been less. Now the problem with what is being suggested here of debt forgiveness and the market is already imputing what the loss is going to be, because these instruments are trading at 30 cents to the dollar, is that out of the $12.5 billion worth of international sovereign bonds or Euro bonds, over $1.5 billion is owned by our banking system basically. So if theoretically that you are going to have a debt forgiveness, not only are they facing a crisis due to the restructuring, but they will have a greater crisis, and we will precipitate the collapse of our entire banking system if we were able to do a debt forgiveness, and we will come out as a bad faith borrower, and our access to the international credit markets that will be necessary after the structural changes that are necessary for our future growth is going to be impaired.
In the interim, how do you suggest we manage all these concerns?
One thing I observed that the IMF did, and many people believe that the IMF did it deliberately, was they delayed assistance to many East Asian countries. Now the IMF denied that, but actually what it resulted in was making all those East Asian countries incredibly vulnerable and having a very weak bargaining position. Let me just give you an example. They delayed assistance to Thailand. And then finally, Thailand was so desperate, they actually accepted many privatizations, which were essentially handing over assets to Western banks. And you can go right through all the other East Asian countries, and they had the same experience. Policymakers, and they did not believe the IMF story that this was some bureaucratic mishap of the IMF, etc. This is deliberate. It strengthens the hands of the creditors, especially those holding ISBs. Now, I think there's nothing actually stopping the IMF coming quickly with emergency assistance of 2.9 billion, except the creditors won't like it. They won't like it because it strengthens Sri Lanka's bargaining hand. And I think that also has to be addressed, and the IMF has to be asked, is this a repetition of the East Asian crisis where you're deliberately withholding support to strengthen the hands of the creditors?
Now, the organization Qatar Charity opened a country office in Sri Lanka, pledging $1 million to the island nation. The Foreign Ministry statement said that the executive officer of the Qatari charity, Yusuf Al-Kuwairi, called on Foreign Minister Ali Sabri at the Foreign Ministry yesterday, where the resumption of projects was discussed after a 2-year ban on the organization in the country. At the meeting, Foreign Minister Ali Sabri welcomed Qatar Charity's projects in Sri Lanka and requested assistance for the vulnerable segments in the fields of health, education, food security, financial empowerment, housing and social care. The CEO of the Qatar charity assured all possible support to Sri Lanka, stating that $11 million worth of projects are identified for Sri Lanka as per the action plan of the Qatar charity of this year. Stay with us for more news after this short commercial break.
It's hard to keep up with the new when you're listening to the same old Slim Bread Week, a week for professionals.
Welcome back. In your business news, Sri Lankan shares edged down today on weak macroeconomic sentiments. The all-share price index closed at 0.56% lower at 8,334.5. The S&P SL20 closed 11.3 points lower at 2,549.92. The market turnover, meanwhile, was 1.9 billion rupees, lower than this month's 2 billion rupees average daily turnover. It is also comparatively much lower than 2022's daily average turnover of 2.9 billion rupees. The market saw a net foreign outflow of 10.5 million rupees today as well. The net foreign inflow for the first 7 sessions of January is 80 million rupees, while the total net foreign inflow of 2022 was 31 billion rupees. Now, key global stocks made modest gains on cautious optimism that US data will confirm inflation is softening, while the yen rose on expectations that the Bank of Japan will review the side effects of its ultra-easy policy. The MSCI gauge of world stocks rose 0.4% to a 4-week high ahead of data expected to show US headline consumer inflation slowed 6.5% in December from 7.1% the previous month, with core inflation seen at annual 5.7%, down from 6% a month earlier. Month-on-month headline inflation is seen at 0. Bonds also rose, mirroring hopes of a soft inflation report, and the US dollar was near 7-month lows against a basket of currencies. Europe's stock 600 equity benchmark index rose to 0.6% to its highest since April 2022. The MSCI's broadest index of Asia-Pacific shares outside Japan rose 0.3% after climbing to a 7-month high, while Japan's Nikkei was steady. S&P 500 futures were broadly steady following gains for Wall Street indexes. Along with expectations that Western central banks will be gentler, investors are also banking on a recovery in China to help global growth and are eyeing a potential policy shift in Japan. The yen rallied as much as 1.2%, accelerating gains after breaking key levels and was last at 130.99 per dollar. 10-year Japanese government bond futures fell to their lowest since May 2014. Foreign exchange markets elsewhere were quieter ahead of the US CPI data, while China's reopening kept a bid under Asia currencies. The dollar index is 0.1% to 103.06. Not far from a 7-month low of 102.93 hit this week. Now here's a look at how the Sri Lankan rupee fared against the other major currencies in the world. And we'll be back with your international news right after this short commercial break.